Okay, so good evening, everyone. Wonderful to have the opportunity to do a little learning with you this evening. And let me begin by thanking our sponsors, Rich Pravda and Erica Grun. I want to wish them Mazel Tov on the birth of a baby boy as they become grandparents. And I want to say that the learning that we'll do is in memory of Yehuda ben Avraham Halevi. May his neshama have an aliyah. So I'd like to pick up in a different part of Eastern Europe tonight. Last week we were in kind of central Poland, and today we're going to move a little east and a little north to present-day Lithuania. Okay. And just to kind of situate things, I mentioned last week that this is the 100th anniversary of Rabbi Young's coming to the Jewish Center in 1922, and the series is in his honor, thinking about personalities that were active in that time in the 1920s, some of whom were known to Rabbi Young personally and directly. I'm not aware of a connection between the altar of Slobodka, our topic for tonight, Rav Nosson Tzvi Finkel. I'm not aware of a connection between him and Rabbi Young, but Rabbi Young did have numerous connections with the students of the altar of Slobodka, and I just put on the source sheet one fascinating letter that I found online, which was a letter written by Rav Aaron Cutler, Rosh Yeshiva of Lakewood, to Rabbi Young. It's written in Hebrew in 1937. And he thanks Rabbi Young for his support, for the support of the yeshiva, and wishing him, all good wishes for Pesach, which is upcoming. And this was just one of many levels of correspondence that Rabbi Young had with the graduates or former students of Slobodka, of whom there are many, and were many, and we'll return to them a little later on. Okay, so who is Rav Nosson Tzvi Finkel, and why are we thinking about him, learning about him, and what is his life and contribution and legacy? Okay, so first of all, just to kind of situate him on the map, we're going to be talking about Slobodka. So Slobodka, this actually is not a great map, but just so you can at least have a little bit of a sense, Slobodka is in present day Lithuania, and let me put up a slightly better map. In present day Lithuania, and it's functionally a suburb of Kaunas. Okay. Kaunas was Kovna in the in Yiddish, or that's always what we called it. If you look on a map today, you'll find the city of Kovna, and Slobodka is like a little suburb of Kaunas. This actually is not to scale, but you can sort of see we're basically just west of Vilnius, which is Vilna. 6-7 kilometers from the center of Kovna is this little suburb called Slobodka. Okay, so we'll talk more about Kovna and Slobodka in a minute. Rav Nosson Tzvi Finkel was born in 1849. We know very little about his younger years and his background. He was orphaned at a very young age. He ended up spending some time in Vilna, which was the big city in Lithuania, and he was sent to study in Kelm under Reb Simcha Zissel Ziv, who was the altar of Kelm, and he was one of the principal disciples of Rabbi Yisrael Salanter. Okay, Rabbi Yisrael Salanter was kind of the grandfather, the father, the initiator of the Musar movement in the 19th century, and that's going to figure very prominently in the story of Slobodka and the altar of Slobodka. So he came of age under the tutelage of Reb Simcha Zissel in this Musar environment in Kelm. Okay, so let me just say something about the background of this moment. Eastern Europe in the second half of the 19th century. And really, sort of the most important thing to know about this moment and the rise of the Musar movement and its prominence is as a kind of response to or reaction to the Haskalah. Okay, so we think often of the Haskalah as emerging in Western Europe and Central Europe, which is all true, but at some point it moves and comes to Eastern Europe as well, certainly by the second half of the 19th century. And for young people, especially the kind of like bright, talented young people who might otherwise be pursuing, time in yeshiva, for that population, the allure of the Haskalah and the prospect of going to university and learning about modernity and maybe getting out of poverty, as the case may be. So there was a lot of allure for this demographic. It was functionally unprecedented, meaning the normative traditional community until the 19th century. So there were some fissures and cracks starting to form, but this was like life altering, the sense that you could have young people sort of leaving the fold of tradition and as we would say in the 21st century, going off the derech, leaving traditional Judaism. And it's a crisis. It's a crisis for the traditional Jewish community living in this moment in Eastern Europe. Okay, and I'll just share with you. There are many sources, and I'm sure I've shared with you in the past that the period that I study. So, sources are far and few between. Like you want to try to find out what was happening in particular moments, you're reliant on a memoir if somebody has one, or somebody left a letter or a book. Once you get to the 19th century, so you have newspapers. People are writing newspapers. People are writing journals. So you have, a flood of data points to kind of get a sense of what's happening in a particular moment, or maybe even a particular day. You could compare 7 different newspapers, and you'll see what's happening in this moment. So I'll just share with you one excerpt from a newspaper in translation of an excerpt from a newspaper called Levine in this moment. Okay, source number 1, if you have the source sheets. So fathers and sons will take heed for the future. This is written anonymously. Fathers and sons will take heed for the future, since His Imperial Majesty has decreed that anyone graduating from the state schools with a diploma of the 2nd rank will not have to do extended military service, but only 3 years instead of the 6 years decreed for all. Okay, so on top of the lure of the Haskalah, there's also an incentive. The government is trying to acculturate its citizens and get them to be, native language speakers and modern citizens of the time. So you could go to university or get some kind of advanced degree and thereby reduce your obligation to serve in the military. Therefore, fathers will take heed for their sons so that their time of service will be reduced to 3 years, and their sons will make every effort to obey them, so that immediately upon leaving school, they may find position in a shop or a trading house. Even those boys who would be most talented in Talmud study do not look back. All their attention is devoted to learning the language of the state and the writing and language of the state, and its ignoramuses seem better to them than learning 500 pages of Talmud by heart, for they profit by it immediately, and they prefer 1 bird in the cage to 10 on the roof. Better to go to university for a little and be assured that you can get a job and have a parnasa and have a life and not have to do 6 years of army service, as opposed to sitting in yeshiva learning Talmud all day. And who knows what the result will be at the end of all of it. Okay, so therefore all leaders and upholders of religion should take counsel as to what to do in order to implant love of the study of Talmud, Rashi, and Tosfos in the hearts of their youth after they leave the state schools, and that the Tov, Torah, and Derech Eretz, that there should be some sense that we're preparing them for a life, and that they're not reliant on going to university and potentially leaving the fold. Okay, and just to give you a sense, there's a letter here in source number 2. I won't put it up on the screen. I'll just share it with you. Rabbi Eliezer Gordon, who was the Rosh Yeshiva in Telz, wrote the following, very personal. He said, because of our manifold sins, it's impossible to gauge the extent of the heresy that has broken out among all the enlightened in our country, both girls and boys. Every day we see girls and boys who only yesterday feared God and his Torah, but have now thrown off all restraint. Heaven protect us. While my sons and daughters, thank God, he's talking about his own family, thank God, follow the way of the Torah and fear God. Who can say how things will be with them, heaven forbid, in a few years' time? Okay. So this is not some, imagined construct. Oh, if we give them a taste of something, we're worried. No, this is happening every day to the families, to the kids, to the young people in Kovna, in Lithuania, in Eastern Europe, and the traditional community is trying every which way to make a dent in this trajectory. There is some speculation. It's hard to verify these things, but there's some speculation that Rav Nosson Tzvi Finkel himself was almost tempted to join the Maskilim, and then somehow decided that he wouldn't. Okay, so my point in all of this is to say that in many ways the Musar movement, which we're going to talk about more in a minute, that in many ways the Musar movement was a response to this crisis. Okay. So, you're a yeshiva bacher, you're 15, 16, 17, and, your friends and neighbors are saying, why don't you join us? You could get out of this backwater and come to university with us and learn about modernity, and it's so interesting, and you'll read interesting books and meet interesting people. And then, there's the Rosh Yeshiva who comes and says, come study Talmud in our yeshiva, and it'll be so comfortable, and we'll follow the tradition. So on some level, that wasn't enough. The Musar movement says, that there's a middle ground. We can do something which is anchored in tradition, and we're going to study Gemara, and we're going to learn the same Rashi Tosfos that you'd be learning in a traditional yeshiva. But there's going to be a new emphasis on the development of the human side of who you are, you potential student. Okay, so this was never going to appeal to the people who were already ready to acculturate. But for someone who was maybe intellectually gifted and would otherwise think about going to yeshiva. So this was a kind of middle ground that was intended to, stave off the dangers of acculturation and enlightenment that, were kind of tearing apart the fabric of the traditional community. So there had been attempts in the past, in the 1840s, 1850s, the Rabbi Yisrael Salanter in Kovna had established like a small Musar, base medrash, and there were people who were interested in Musar. This was happening a little, but the Slobodka Yeshiva was really the first full-fledged attempt at a Musar yeshiva. Okay. So in the end of the 1870s, the Alter of Slobodka, Alter means like the old man of Slobodka. So it's a little funny because he was in his 20s at the time. But at the end of the 1870s, he comes to Slobodka, and there were already functioning yeshivas in Slobodka. It wasn't like there was no yeshiva in town and he started the yeshiva. There were functioning yeshivas in town, and he was teaching in them, and he cultivated. Some of them were gifted, students, and he started a kollel for advanced study, and he interested people in this idea of studying Musar. And around, we don't even really know, but somewhere 1881, 1882, he begins to have this group coalesce into a Musar yeshiva. Okay, so just to zoom out for a second. So we're in Kovna in the beginning of the 1880s. So what does Kovna look like? The Jewish population in Kovna in 1864 was about 16,000. By 1897, it had already jumped to 32,000. I take that back. to 25,000 in 1897. By 1908, it was 32,000. So it went from being around 30% of Kovna's population was Jewish. By the beginning of the 20th century, it was already 40%. Okay, so it was a growing population. Again, we're not talking about huge numbers, but 30,000 Jews, that's a real population. Why was it growing, by the way? So hard to know, but certainly the fact that it was located on a new road between Warsaw and St. Petersburg was important. There was a major rail line which was established in the 1860s. Kovna was on the ascendancy, and Slobodka was primed for this moment. Okay, so let me just share with you a little bit about how the students perceived the altar of Slobodka. Take you a little bit more through his biography, and then we'll jump into some of the Torah that he left us. Okay. So let me put up on the screen. This is a memoir by one of the students, former students of Slobodka. And he wrote the following. This should be, I think I put it on your source sheet. This should be source number 3. So in source number 3, this is the memoir description of the altar of Kelm. He says, never did the Saba order or command or scold his students. He behaved just like a father to the yeshiva students, and he practiced what he preached. He was concerned not only with the spirituality of his students, but also with their physical needs and with their future. The old man played a part in his students' lives even after they had left the yeshiva. His students consulted him about everything and eagerly awaited his advice and his decision, which was always worthwhile. The yeshiva students were also educated to behave like brothers to each other. There was no jealousy about honor among the students of Slobodka. Okay. So I didn't mention this, but it's actually very important. And that is, the altar of Slobodka was never the Rosh Yeshiva, okay, which is fascinating. The Rosh Yeshiva is the titular head of the yeshiva. He gives the central shiur, the most important shiur. He's the biggest Talmid Chacham. He's the most prominent scholar in the place. The altar of Slobodka was never that person. He was the mashkiach. Mashkiach, we have a mashkiach like in a, it just means someone who supervises. So it's short in the yeshiva for mashkiach ruchani. He's responsible for the spiritual supervision of the students. There had always been a mashkiach in the yeshiva, in addition to the Rosh Yeshiva, who was the principal teacher, but he elevated this role into something entirely new. Okay, so he was responsible for the finances of the yeshiva. He was responsible for the recruitment of the boys, the entrance exams, the rooming, the boarding. We'll talk more about that in a second. He was responsible for all of it. Never wanted to be the center of attention. It was his job and it was his role to provide, the Musar education and to sculpt and mold the students into great people. Okay. So I'll just share with you one anecdote, right? There's 1,000, and we have actually lots of them because so many great rabbis of the 20th century all over the world were products of Slobodka, and they remembered, to their students or to posterity in memoirs, the image of the altar of Slobodka. So Rabbi Yaakov Weinberg, who was the famed author of the Srida Eish. Vicky, give me 1 second.
Yeah.
And he was a student in Slobodka, and he once came over to the altar of Slobodka and he said, Rebbe, I have a confession to make. What's the confession? He said, I'm a little embarrassed, but sometimes I'm so wrapped up in my learning that I miss mincha. So the altar of Slobodka said, I'll tell you what you should do. Go tell this to Rav Naftali Amsterdam, who was, one of the other great students of Rabbi Yisrael Salanter, who happened to be visiting. He was an imposing figure. He was visiting Slobodka. So Rab Yechiel Yaakov Weinberg goes over to Rab Naftali of Amsterdam and says, I have a confession to make. Sometimes I get so wrapped up in my learning, I miss mincha. And Rab Naftali Amsterdam said, what are you talking about? You don't mean to say you miss mincha. You mean to say you miss mincha with a minyan, right? It can't possibly be that you miss mincha altogether. And Reb Yechiel Yaakov Weinberg just lied. He said, "No, yeah, of course, that's exactly what I mean." Okay, he came back, told the Alter of Slobodka the story, and he said, I was so embarrassed by the reaction of Naftali Amsterdam, that I understand like the gravity of what this is all about. The Alter Slobodka had this like uncanny ability to understand, who the students were, what would move them, what would motivate them, what kind of direction they needed. And he provided this kind of extraordinary individuated, human attention, which was unprecedented in any yeshiva up until this time. Vicky.
I could use a clarification on how you defined the Musar program of teaching. What is the curriculum when you say Musar?
Okay, so that's great. We're going to talk about it, and I've sort of been talking around it, and you will talk. We'll actually look at some of his teachings, so you'll get a sense and a flavor for what it is that we're talking about. But since you bring it up now, I'll just say a word about it, which is, there had always been an interest in Musar, in yeshiva curricula, to the extent yeshivas existed, for hundreds, if not thousands of years. So Pirkei Avos is Musar. The Talmud is full of, statements about how we should live as ethical human beings and treat one another. It's the principal curriculum is Ben Adam Lamakom, right, is the sense of how we need to act in human and interpersonal relationships. Okay, so again, this had always been studied, but just sort of haphazard, by the by. So the chap, the chiddush, the contribution of the Musar Yeshiva was that the study of Musar was elevated into its own curriculum right next to Talmud. Okay, so we're studying Gemara for X number of hours, and we're going to study Musar for Y number of hours. It's not just going to be, pick up here and there that, before Mincha and Shabbos afternoon, you say a little Pirkei Avos. No, we're actually going to make it into something prominent as a part of the yeshiva curriculum. So he was so dedicated to his students that he spent actually 10 out of 12 months of the year living apart from his wife and his family in the yeshiva with his students. Okay. Now, let me just show you, rather than saying this piece, I'll just show it to you so you can visualize it. This is a collection of photographs from the yeshiva students, I think in the 1920s. Okay, and I'll try to enlarge it a little so you could see it more clearly. I'm sorry, I can do one better if I put it up here. Tell me if this is mostly visible. You don't need to see any one student, and just call out or put it in the chat. Tell me what you notice about the students of this yeshiva. There's many answers to this question. Anything you notice, right?
They're all clean shaven.
Yeah. Okay. So first of all, they're all clean shaven, right? Fascinating.
All ties.
All wearing ties, right? What else?
Even a bow tie or two.
Even a bow tie or two. So, so if you asked me to draw a picture or to describe for you what, an Eastern European yeshiva looked like in the 1890s or the 1920s, so I had everyone in a black coat, in a white shirt, in a black hat. Just notice, by the way, I'm sorry it's not in color, all the hats are different. All the ties are different, right? They're all clean shaven. This is a bunch of different kids, right? They're totally unlike one another. They're individuals, and this was a key aspect of the Slobodka, identity, which is we're not trying to create one cookie cutter graduate of this yeshiva. We're going to cater it to every kind of student, and we're going to make whoever you are, we're going to make you the best you could be. Okay, and we're going to come back to this as a big theme, but just notice how dapper these guys look. Okay, and this was a real revolution in the notion of what we're trying to do and who we're trying to develop in this yeshiva. Okay. So they're not, everyone looks good, right? They're well dressed, and they're clean shaven, and they're proper. So this was part of the image that the Alter of Slobodka tried to cultivate among his yeshiva students. Look proper. Don't look like a schlump. You're a person. You're a mensch. Act like it and dress like it. Okay, and this was, again, a total revolution. You would know a Slobodka student instantly just by the way they dressed, just by the way they appeared. So the yeshiva quickly became earned a reputation as a place that was popular for people to be. Question?
Yes, just quick question about.
Yeah.
So you're saying that they dressed that way because of the yeshiva rather than they came that way to the yeshiva?
Exactly. It might have
It
been a
wasn't
little
catering
of
to
both.
modern folks. It was, he had them.
Right. Again, a little maybe chicken and egg, but the idea was, we're not trying to get you into a particular look. A, we want to retain your individuality, and B, we want you to, present yourself as a high-level person because that's who we believe you are.
What year was that picture?
It's a good question. I think this is a little later. I think this is the 1920s.
The 20s, yeah.
Yeah, and you could tell a little, I think the hats, yeah. Okay, so the yeshiva gained a reputation. It became very well known, and just sort of by accident of history, the Volozhin yeshiva, which was probably the most prominent and well-known yeshiva for just about the whole of the 19th century, opened in the first years of the 1800s. It closed in 1892. Okay. So there was an influx in the 1890s of kids who had been students in the Volozhin yeshiva and people who would have gone there if it had been around. So instead, they end up going to Slobodka. For many years, there was a German Jew by the name of Emil Lachmann who lived in Berlin, who funded the yeshiva. Okay, every yeshiva was poor and every yeshiva needed money, but this was a real boon from some kind of German millionaire. Why was he funding an Eastern European yeshiva in Slobodka? So again, Western Europe, they're like a little ahead of the game. He saw what was happening, with the reform and with the Enlightenment, and he wanted to kind of stave off that phenomenon in Eastern Europe to protect and maintain the traditional community. So he invested in Slobodka, and that was a boon to the yeshiva. Okay. Now, all of this said, anytime you start a revolution, anytime you do something a little different, a little new, so there's going to be trouble. And there was often trouble in the Slobodka yeshiva. Some people went there not even necessarily knowing the full extent of what this yeshiva was all about. They heard it had a nice reputation. Their friends went there, they're good graduates, so they go. And then they get there, and instead of it being the whole day learning Gemara, which is what they expected, half the day is Gemara, now half is Musar. They're like, well, we didn't sign up for that. So there's a revolution, in the revolution. In 1897, there's a huge controversy, and there's a kind of anti-Musar movement, ironically, that starts up, percolates in the yeshiva. There's a group that's take all the Musar Sfarim and take them out of the Beis Medrash. With great equanimity, Rabbi Yisrael Salanter says, "Fine, if it's not for you, it's fine. Meaning everyone should have their own approach. Anyone who wants to do the Musar approach, come with me, and anyone who doesn't, there's an alternative for you. And it doesn't bother me at all. So at that point, we don't know exactly the numbers, but there's, let's say, 250 students in the Slobodka Yeshiva. 200 of them, the vast majority, break off and say, we're not doing this Musar thing anymore. And about 50 go with Rabbi Israel, with Nassim Tzvi Finkel, with the Alter of Slobodka, and they start, their own branch of this Slobodka Yeshiva. Okay. So I'll just say this is actually really interesting, a kind of footnote to this story. So what are the names of these two yeshivas? Okay. So this is 1897. So the Slobodka yeshiva that breaks off and doesn't want to do Musar names themselves after Rabbi Yitzchak Elchanan Spector, who was the great Gadol Hador who had lived in Kovna and died in 1896. Okay, so they named themselves Knesses Yitzchak after Rabbi Yitzchak Elchanan Spector, and Reb Nassim Tzvi Finkel and his yeshiva called themselves Knesses Yisrael after Rabbi Yisrael Salanter, right, the founder of the Musar movement. So why do I say this is so interesting? Because the same thing happened in America. What other yeshiva do you know that's named after Rabbi Yitzchak Elchanan Spector?
YU. Yeshiva University.
RIETS,
Elchanan.
R-I-E-T-S, right? It's Rabbi Isaac Elchanan Theological. What does Rabbi Yitzchak Elchanan have to do with the price of tea in China? He was a Rosh Yeshiva in Kovna. So it happened to be, RIETS started in 1897, and it was a big kavod to name the yeshiva after the Gadol Hador in Lithuania. The roots of YU are Lithuanian, Talmud learning. So they named it after the Gadol Hador. But there was a second level of meaning to naming it Rabbi Yitzchak Elchanan, which is as opposed to naming it after Rabbi Israel Salanter, to indicate we're not a Musar yeshiva. We're just learning Gemara. Who named themselves after Rabbi Yisrael Salanter? Ner Yisrael, okay, which was founded by students of Reb Nassim Tzvi Finkel, right, in Slobodka, who had attended Knesses Yisrael. Closer to home, by the way. So what's the S of SAR?
Salanter.
Salanter. How'd they get to be called Salanter, right? The 1,000 great rabbis in Jewish history, they picked that one? No, because they were founded on this notion of not just developing kids as traditional Talmud learners, but we're going to develop the person from a Musar perspective. So anytime you see Yisrael in the name of a yeshiva, that's Rabbi Yisrael Salanter. If you see Yitzchak in the name of the yeshiva, that's Yitzchak Elchanan Spector, non-Musar yeshiva. 1902, there's another controversy. It's even more acrimonious. At some point, the acrimony dies down, and there's two yeshivas in Slobodka, and they're able to function. One is not doing Musar, one is doing Musar. Okay, so just to wrap up the story of Rav Nassim Tzvi Finkel, and then we'll do a little learning together. So 1914. World War I breaks out, and the yeshiva students, the faculty, and a big part of the Kovna community flees. Most of them go to Minsk, which was further from the front lines. The Germans started bombing Minsk. Most of the yeshiva ended in a place called Kremenchug, something like that. 1920. They finally make it back to Slobodka and pick up where they left off. Okay, so I just can't resist. I know we don't really have time, but as I said, I love the newspaper clippings because they're so fascinating. So 1924. Again, this is a revolutionary guy. He makes a revolutionary decision. It may have had to do with different factors. One of them requiring more enlistment in the military. It might have been political. It might have been economic. But Reb Nassim Tzvi Finkel decides we're out of here. We're taking off, and he takes some of his prized pupils and he leaves Eastern Europe, and he sets up shop where? In Hebron. in Hebron in Palestine, right? British Mandatory Palestine, 1924. He sets up shop in Palestine. Okay, so I'll just put it on the screen because again I can't resist. But here are the couple of clippings that I put on. They should be on your source sheets, sources 4 and 5. Okay, so this is really interesting. Someone has to look more into this. But Australian Jewish Herald, September 25th, 1924. Here's the story. A part of the well-known yeshiva of Slobodka may be transferred to Palestine and established in Hebron. Where'd that come from? As suggested by Mr. Usishkin, chairman of the Keren Kayemet in Jerusalem. We know him because the street in Jerusalem is named after him. So Usishkin was the head of JNF. So during his European tour, in the interests of JNF, Mr. Usishkin addressed a great gathering at Kovna, consisting chiefly of leaders and members of Agudath Israel. Okay, again, we don't think of like Aguda and labor Zionists like getting together in Kovna. But Mr. Usishkin succeeded in creating a more friendly attitude on the part of these leaders towards Zionist work. Fascinating. Okay, as an expression of confidence and appreciation, they invited Mr. Usishkin to visit the renowned yeshiva. Okay, and this labor Zionist is going to Slobodka, and I don't know, but a couple months later, Slobodka comes to Hebron. Okay, source number 5.
What was really revolutionary was there was the first yeshiva that spoke Hebrew, that taught in Hebrew.
Yeah, because they were sitting there learning in Hebron, right? Which is amazing. And today, the yeshiva of Hebron, the Hebron yeshiva in Jerusalem, right in Geula, is the Slobodka yeshiva. But there's also a branch in Bnei Brak. But that is the Hebron yeshiva. Okay, source number 5. We'll have to find another opportunity to look at it, but it's amazing. There's a delegation, including the Rosh Yeshiva of Slobodka, comes with Rav Kook in 1924 to fundraise, and they write about it as they're heading back to Europe in the end of 1924. So they raise the funds. I'll just put it up. I didn't put this on your source sheet, but there's this amazing picture, and again, we'll look at it another time. But this is Mayor John Hyland on the right with those 3 gentlemen. So from left to right, you have Moshe Mordechai Epstein, the Rosh Yeshiva of Slobodka, Rav Abraham Dov Ber Kahana Shapiro, the Rav of Kovna, and Rav Abraham Yitzchak Cohen Cook holding the staff. So with the mayor of New York, like when's the last time 3 European rabbis came to New York and got greeted by the mayor? It's quite an extraordinary story. Okay, there's a tragic sort of conclusion, which it's not the conclusion, but a tragic chapter in this story. 1929. So the Alter Slobodka is already dead. He died in 1927, shortly after the yeshiva moved, and he moved along with them to Palestine. 1929. There's the Arab riots in Hebron. 67 Jews are killed, among them 24 students from the Slobodka yeshiva. 8 of them were Americans. These are just the pictures because I found an article about it. These are the pictures of the American boys who had gone from wherever they were in North America to learn in Slobodka in Hebron, and they were murdered during the riots in 1929. 2 of them had been students at Yeshiva University. Okay, so the legacy of the altar of Slobodka is extraordinary. Sometimes you think like, okay, so this is a long time ago, and he affected whoever his students were, and we moved right along. So let me just share with you a few. This is just like the smattering. Okay, who were his students? Okay, Rabbi Eliezer Yehuda Finkel from the Mir Yeshiva in Yerushalayim. Rabbi Yitzchak Hutner, the Rosh Yeshiva of Rav Chaim Berlin in New York. Rabbi Yaakov Kamenetsky, the Rosh Yeshiva of Torah V'das. Rav Avraham Eliyahu Kaplan, who was active in the Hildesheimer Rabbinical Seminary in Berlin. Rav Aaron Cutler, who we began with, of Lakewood, turned Lakewood into Lakewood. Rav David Leibowitz, Yeshivas Chafetz Chaim in Queens. Rav Yaakov Yitzchak Ruderman, Ner Yisrael. Rabbi Yecheskel Sarna, head of the Hebron Yeshiva in Jerusalem. Rabbi Isaac Sher, head of the Slobodka Yeshiva in Bnei Brak. Rabbi Yechiel Yaakov Weinberg, who we talked about earlier, Hildesheimer Rabbinical Seminary, the author of the Shrita H. Saul Lieberman, Jewish Theological Seminary, on and on and on. Right? These were individuals sculpted, crafted, and molded into the people they were, and they all credit him. Right? They all walked around proudly. It's not like they just happened to be passing through. They all considered themselves Talmidim, students, disciples of Rav Nosson Tzvi Finkel, the altar of Slobodka, and they brought to their own institutions, right, which are pillars of world Jewry. They brought the teachings of their Rebbe, Rav Nosson Tzvi Finkel. Okay, so you talk about impact and influence and legacy. It's quite extraordinary to think of the breadth of this man. He left us no svarim. He wrote nothing in his lifetime. It wasn't his interest. He was never a Rosh Yeshiva. He was just like the mashgiach. He was responsible for the recruitment and you just think about like if there would be somebody functioning in that role today, and what we would think of like, oh, they're the director of X, Y, and Z, the second level. No, I'm saying this the influence this man had was nothing less than extraordinary. Let me pause here, and then I want to share with you, time permitting, a couple of teachings that will give you a flavor, back to Vicky's question, for the kinds of the Musar that he shared in his yeshiva.
Rabbi, why isn't Muslim more popular in modern Orthodoxy?
That's a great question. Maybe after this class, it will be. We can always hope. We can always aspire. It's a question I don't really have the answer to, other than to say, a lot of it is just circumstance. So if you were a product of a certain line of yeshiva, so it just became less of an. Nobody had a big opposition to it. It was always a question of emphasis. No one says you shouldn't learn Musar, right? It's just there's only so many hours in a day. What do we prioritize? And for some reason, it became one thing, at the expense of the other.
I was just wondering if the reason that why you graduates, REITs graduates behave so badly is because they didn't get Musar, because REITs was from the other side.
Maybe they need more Musar. I could be.
But why is it, can I ask, why is it that when you're talking about all his disciples, their schools don't emphasize Musar at all? They're straight yeshiva Gemara learning.
So it's true, meaning they didn't, by and large, transplant the Slobodka model, in its entirety. But here and there are pieces. Again, I'm not an expert on the difference between Chaim Berlin and Chafetz Chaim, and some of it may have been circumstantial. A lot of this had to do with where we were post-Holocaust. And for many, there was a sense like we don't have the luxury of doing anything other than like plugging away and just let's rebuild what was. And again, it comes back to the question of sort of emphasis and priority. But that's like a 20th century history question.
Rabbi, also my question further from where I started was, they were trying to counter the flow of students to university studies.
Mhm.
I don't see them adding in mathematics, science, literature. I mean, I do see philosophy, yes, but.
Right. No, so that's an important point, meaning this was not extend a branch to instead of coming to university where you're going to spend 6 hours reading Kant and Hegel, so come here and you'll spend 3 hours. No, that wasn't what they were saying. It was a kind of alternate approach where you could sort of say, that's interesting. This is equally interesting. Something like that. I don't know if that's the perfect formulation, but your point is well taken. So let me see if in the time that we have remaining, if I can communicate to you two important sort of takeaways. Rav Nosson Tzvi Finkel and give you a flavor for the kind of learning that he did. Source number 6 is a medrash that he was fond of quoting, and I'll just summarize it for you. At the end of Shoftim, there's a terrible incident that we know, Pilegesh Begiva, basically, a terrible, terrible, tragic story of rape and animosity and fratricide and civil war. It's a terrible, terrible story. And the Medrash says, in the end of that story, there were 72,000 people who died. So the Medrash says, like, how did that happen? What was behind that story? Why did things go off the rails in that moment? The Medrash says that when the Sanhedrin got set up, when the Jewish people came to the land of Israel, so what they should have done is they should have dispersed all over the land to make sure that every community had spiritual leadership, and they should have picked themselves up and gone out onto the road and taken the Torah and its values onto the road, and that would have made all the difference. But they failed. The leadership failed to do that. They planted themselves, where they were, and each person said, this is my place, and I'm worried about my little community. And the Medrash says, and that's why that tragedy unfolded. And Rabbi Nosson Tzvi Finkel, quoted that Medrash all the time, and he said, that's on us. We can't just hang out in our little community and think that, if we've cared for little Kavna or Slobodka, we're Yosie and we're good to go. So what he would do, and again, this was just extraordinary, is he would take his top, most gifted disciples, and he would dispatch them. He'd hear from a particular community, like, we're suffering, there's an issue, we're culture, we need help. He'd say, okay, you 10 guys, you're on a mission. Right? This is like Chabad before Chabad, and not one. It's like, take a group and set yourself up. You'll be a kollel, you'll be a base medrash, you'll teach Torah, you'll raise people's spirits, you'll give them an anchor, you'll give them a base, and this is what he did for one community after another. This was a huge part of the way that he functioned. The Chafetz Chaim had a great line about Rav Nosson Tzvi Finkel. He said, I write books. That's my contribution. The Rav Nosson Tzvi Finkel, the altar of Slobodka, so he makes people. And that captures so much of what the altar of Slobodka did. If you had to sum up, and I would say if you're going to take away one message from the life and legacy of Rav Nosson Tzvi Finkel, it should be the following. It should be the notion of Gadlus Ha'adam. And I touched on it a little when I showed you the picture of the students, this sense that the Nosson Tzvi Finkel wanted every student to recognize that he had this extraordinary capacity to be great, and he just wanted to launch the student on the path of becoming great. Okay, so I'll just share with you. Let's just do a drop of learning. And again, this is based on his teachings. He didn't leave anything in writing, but his students gathered some of his teachings. So we have some of them, secondhand. So join me, if you will. This is source number 7, and we won't have time to go through the whole thing, but I'll just share with you a quick summary. Okay. So source number 7, it starts with a question. It says, "B'kiddush Yom Shel Shabbos Kasav Zikaron L'Masa Bereshis Ki Yom Techila Mikra Kodesh Zecher L'Yitzias Mitzrayim." And so we say this right every Shabbos, and we know it by heart. And how often do we pause and think about it? So we say that Shabbos is a commemoration of Masa Bereshis. Okay, 6 days of creation, a day of rest. So that's obvious. Ki Yom Techila Mikra Kodesh, because Shabbos is the first of the Mikra Kodesh, the holidays, right, which all are kind of modeled on Shabbos. Zecher L'Yitzias Mitzrayim. So what's Zecher L'Yitzias Mitzrayim? So is that last clause qualifying Shabbos, or is it qualifying the holidays? So it's a machlokes, and the Torah says no, it's qualifying the holidays. The holidays, it's the Shabbos is the first of the holidays, which are a commemoration to Yetzias Mitzrayim. We always say, Pesach, Zecher Yetzias Mitzrayim, Sukkot, Shavuos. Okay, so we get that. The Rambam says, no, Zecher Yetzias Mitzrayim is Shabbos. Shabbos is also, it's not just Zecher L'Maaseh Bereshis, it's Zecher Yetzias Mitzrayim. He says, I want to understand why that should be. And he goes on to say that really Yetzias Mitzrayim is a kind of amplification of the message of Shabbos. Because Yetzias Mitzrayim tells us, right, not just that God was involved in the world in the creation narrative, but that God is involved in the world in every moment. It's not just that he created miracles once, but that he continues to do miraculous things all the time. And then he goes on to say in the bold, he says, "V'kavanas haborei bazeh she'adam lo yamod b'makom echad yischadesh k'mo she'adam, ela shebehischadshus yelech v'yalev yapach la'adam chadash, la'adam ila yoser." He says God is recreating the world in a kind of amplified way all the time. And a person is being recreated at every moment. So the person that I am now is not the same person I was 5 minutes ago. God reinvigorates the world and all the people in the world at every moment, and you become a greater person with each passing moment. V'yachad im hischadchuso v'hisaluso hu yaleito es kol habriya shegam hi lo tischadesh k'mo shaysa el tischadesh v'tisaleh kirau l'gabei adam mechudash. You become recreated, and you become a more impressive and higher level person. It's never ending. The capacity for growth and development is infinite. A person is created in the divine image, right? And this was central to the philosophy of the altar of Slobodka. To be created in a divine image means that your roots are in something that is eternal and without end. And so your human capacity must be understood and recognized as being equally without end. There's like nothing you're incapable of. And he goes on to say, and you can look at it in the sources, I'll just summarize it for you. He says, God asked the malachim at creation to name the animals. They couldn't do it. He brought them in front of Adam Arishon, and he could. He says, we have this impression that like malachim are up there and we're down. No, we have extraordinary capacities beyond what the angels are capable of. He quotes a medrash. I love this medrash. It's unbelievable. The medrash says that after Hashem asked Adam Harishon to give names to all of the creations in the world, Hashem turned to Adam and he said, "What's my name?" And Adam Harishon said, "We should call you Hashem, Ado Shem, because you are the Adon, you are the master of the universe." And Hashem concurs, right? Which is like this, like how do you even put words to it? But it's not just that mankind has a capacity to, name the animals and it supersedes what angels are even capable of. Man is the one who named God. Like, how do you even wrap your head around that? So Nosson Tzvi Finkel used to, come back to this theme all the time and just build on this notion that you're capable of anything as a human being created b'tzelem Elokim. You should act like it. You should dress like it. We should set the highest expectations for people because, right, you could achieve them. There's nothing that you can't achieve. There's one last piece that I put on the source sheet, and if we have 2 minutes, I'll just kind of summarize it for you. It happens to be that I found a translation online, so you have it. It's accessible. It's source number 9 on your source sheet. But he continues to develop this this notion that that human capacity is basically infinite and basically unlimited. I'll just share with you this one paragraph in English toward the end of the source sheet. He says, "The divinity within us obligates us to become whom we really are in potential, whom we were created to be, to release the potential within each of us and become people who truly reflect God's image. Tselem Elokim. You know, when we say in Pirkei Avos, sometimes we'll have a teaching and it'll say, Hu haya omer. Rabbi Soloveitchik always used to say, it doesn't mean he said this like once. Hu haya omer should be translated as he used to say it. It was a mantra. Like, you know, ask anybody who you spend time in the Jewish Center in the 50s, 60s, and 70s. So they'd say Rabbi Young would always talk about the 3 R's: reverence, righteousness, Rahman, and it was like it was a theme. So he gave a different sermon every week, I can assure you, but he often came back to this theme. So the altar of Slobodka, Hu haya omer. This is what he used to teach. This is what he used to preach, and this is how he used to live, with this sense that you're a Tselem Elokim, every person created in the divine image. Don't sell yourself short. You should present yourself as a Tselem Elokim. You should look like a Tselem Elokim. You should create expectations for yourself as a Tselem Elokim, not a nudnik, right? The godless ha'adam. The last thing I'll say is this was revolutionary. There were other Mussar yeshivas, and this just to sort of tie things together. The predominant school of thought in the Mussar movement until Slobodka was the opposite. It was shiflus ha'adam. You know, they tell the story in Kelm. The idea was to like break you. You should know you're nothing. You're always a nothing, and you're right. You're lowly and you're small and you're nothing, and you should just be humble because you're such a zero. And they'd, you know, have like they'd send you into the hardware store and say, ask for a dozen eggs. And the guy at the hardware store would be like, what are you smoking? You don't buy eggs in a hardware store, you dummy. Right. And so you go on that errand and you come out having been called a dummy and you're broken and you're humbled. And Slobodka was the opposite. No, you're not low. You're great. You're at Tselem Elokim. You have such extraordinary potential. Who knows what you could achieve in this world, right? So the altar made people, as the Chafetz Chaim described, right? He made people because the altar believed in people, right? He saw in every student, in every person, something extraordinary, maybe even unlimited potential. And he communicated that to them directly and indirectly through his love and his care and his attention and his wisdom and by personal example. And if in a moment like this, we're ever feeling low, all we have to do is think about the altar of Slobodka, who was quite certain that we could achieve untold greatness to the extent we believe in ourselves, in our own capacity to achieve that greatness. I'm going to pause here, and I'll just remind everyone that next